sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Name is Bruce, call sign G4ABX. Right, what we're going to do this morning is a little bit different from that I would normally do, which would be to show you a rig or an antenna or a computer or something. I'm going to attempt to show you how to solder. I've noticed a few posts as I've been going through where people have attempted to solder, and because of probably a lack of knowledge, experience, training, whatever, could have done a better job. So I thought I'd just explain to you what I use to solder and how I do it. I've been soldering now for 55 plus years, I would say. And I just think I'll run through a bunch of the tools that I think you need, and then we'll actually do a little bit of soldering just to show you how straightforward it really is. And it is pretty straightforward. Okay, so let's start at the left here. Cutters, side cutters. You're going to need a pair of side cutters. These fellas, they're spring-loaded, so they work fine in the hand. You can clip these. These, by the way, Lindstrom were pretty expensive when I bought them 45 years ago. So as you can see, I've had them a very long time. They've never been sharpened, they've never been maintained in any way, as you can probably tell by the rather grubby yellow. And the only thing I have to do occasionally is squeeze the handles back up to make sure the spring tension's there. Really excellent Lindstrom. The ones next to them are a very inexpensive set from, I bought them from Amazon. And these live in my portable tool set. When I go operating portable radio, you need a few tools, and cutters are always an important item. There's no point trying to cut things, wire and cables and things, with knives and that sort of thing. So you want a reasonable pair, and this is a pair. I think they were about £12. So really good value, and they probably won't last 45 years, but frankly, unless you're going to have a career in electronics, that's not very important. The fact that they all work and will do you well is important. Next to those, a pair of snipe nose pliers. Again, spring-loaded, absolutely vital, because when you're holding components and you've got a hot soldering iron and you bring the two together, it's good not to be holding the cable, the wire of the thing you're soldering directly. So a pair of snipe nose pliers are really useful. Again, these are probably more than 20 years old. I've had them pretty much forever. This fella is a vital addition. If you make the odd mistake, which I do regularly, it's essentially an aluminium tube with a plunger inside with a spring and a piece of metal on the end, and it is essentially what we call a solder sucker, which is a reverse vacuum pump. Basically, you charge the spring inside, push the button, and if you put that nozzle up against what it is you're trying to desolder, push the button, it'll suck all the solder into the cavity of the unit. This is a PTFE nozzle. You can buy replacement nozzles, really very simple things. And it fills up with solder, and you just basically push the solder out by pushing the plunger beyond the normal operating position. So a really useful piece of kit, not very expensive, maybe £10, something like that, but worth thinking about. When you get onto smaller components, then a pair of tweezers is useful. Make sure you buy tweezers that are made from stainless steel. Otherwise, you'll approach these with your soldering iron and you'll solder them together, which is probably not a great idea. So you want some stainless steel tweezers. This fella is used for cleaning. Essentially, it's I demonstrate. Soldering iron's not on at the moment. It's basically copper wire wool. A bit like a Brillo pad or wire wool that you'd buy. This is made of copper, and as such it attracts solder easily, and basically to clean the tip of your soldering iron you simply plunge it into that, and that will clean it off, no problem at all. Then these fellas, you'll find pretty quickly when you start making anything that you haven't got enough hands. So this is a pair of what are called helping hands. Really simple. This one's a bit of an adjustable couple of bits of metal, a couple of crocodile clips, and these are great for holding things that you're going to solder. Really simple, but worked really well and absolutely invaluable. These I think came with a magnifying glass, big magnifying glass, but it was useless. It just got in the way, so I took it off and I don't use it. But these are really good. Again, I've probably had these 10 years, something like that. Excellent, excellent device for £10. I think it cost me, and they're not much more now. Now to solder. Solder itself. You may, if you read about electronics, see there's lots of information these days that things are made out of lead-free solder. For stuff that you're making yourself, don't go near lead-free solder. It's a nightmare to use. It gives very poor joints unless you've got everything perfect. And do what I do, which is to use the standard tin lead 6040 solder. The solder here, not very wide in diameter, it's probably a couple of mil in diameter, something like that. But internally to this solder, there is flux, and flux is absolutely necessary for making a clean soldered joint. And you'll see all of that when I start soldering in the not too distant future. But fluxed, so flux cores in the solder. I probably had this reel, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, and in fact it's getting a bit down now, so I've just bought myself a new reel. Expect to pay anything from, I don't know, a few pounds to maybe £25, depending on the weight. And this amount of solder would probably last me another 5 to 10 years, who knows. But solder, tin lead, don't go anywhere near the unleaded solder. It's a nightmare. And then to the soldering iron. So let's just have I'll move these things out of the way. Let's have a quick look at the soldering iron. If you are going to do some soldering, then I advise you to invest in a temperature controlled soldering iron. This one is not very expensive. I think it was probably about £40. You can buy replacement soldering irons because they will eventually wear out, although I probably had this one now 3 or 4 years. I have 2 spare soldering irons. They weren't very expensive. This is all temperature controlled, so when you turn it on, which I've done now, you can probably see that I've got mine set for 400 degrees. There's a temperature sensor in the tip of the soldering iron, and when that gets up to 400 degrees, that'll be denoted on the front of the soldering station. It doesn't matter whether it's a digital soldering station or an analog one, in other words, whether you've got a knob to twiddle to get the thing up to temperature, but you need to make sure you can get one that will do 400 degrees. There's no point in having one that'll do less. It's good to turn it down occasionally, but mostly I would say 90% of the time I'm soldering at 400 degrees. So this one's set for 400 degrees centigrade, that is, so pretty warm, which is why you need to be reasonably careful when you're actually applying solder and working with a soldering iron. There's another item here. This is it's a wrist strap. It's a conductive wrist strap. It's a bit like the bracelet, the metal stainless steel bracelet on a watch, and this basically makes contact with your skin. The other end, this mat that I'm using here, this bluish mat, is in fact conductive. So all you do, I'll just move the camera a fraction. All you do is clip your anti-static wrist strap to the mat and you're done. The mats are pretty expensive. I think I paid about £80 for this 20 years ago. 20 years comes up quite often, doesn't it? It's quite a while since I've had to buy any bits and pieces for doing this part of the hobby. They all last so long if you treat them well. So there you go. That's It'll only be important when you start soldering things like microprocessors, integrated circuits, field effect transistors. You may not know what those things are yet, but as we go through these short videos, then hopefully you'll find out. I'll be able to tell you a bit more about those things. So one of the things that frustrates me often with YouTube videos is that people say they're going to do stuff in 3 videos time, and I'd actually like to see people doing stuff now. So what I thought I would do is I'll actually do a bit of soldering and show you the best way to solder. Now let's start with the soldering iron. This chap is now hot. It's at 400 degrees C. In the base of the soldering iron stand there is a wetted pad. This is just a bit of kitchen cloth, I think, because the other pad's worn out ages ago. This does very well. Keep it moist. My flipping phone keeps blinking at me. Get rid of that. Keep it moist, and before you make any joint, give the thing a wipe. You want a clean tip, and every 4 or 5 joints plunge it into this copper device, and that will make sure that it's absolutely clean. Now to solder, it's not very difficult, but it's not totally intuitive. You need a bit of training to be able to solder, and I thought what I would do was have a go at soldering one of these headers. It's quite a difficult thing to solder. I've got a piece of pegboard here, or a piece of board, and the correct way, I'll just insert this through, show you what I'm doing. So I'm just inserting the header through the board, and as you can see, hopefully you can see, the parts I'm going to solder are on the back here. Now, being very careful not to hold the pin, I'm going to solder this pin in that's at the end. So being very careful not to hold that one, I'm just going to tack that pin to the board. And the way you do that is you approach both with the soldering iron and then the solder. So what's really important when you're soldering is you have to heat up both items. So you have to heat up the pin. I'll take the tweezers, maybe point out. You have to heat up the pin, and you have to heat up the pad. You can't put solder on your soldering iron and bring it to the item you're trying to solder. That will just give you what is called a dry joint, and it's completely hopeless in terms of soldering. So having just soldered that one pin, that's now holding this device, holding this quite nicely, and I can go ahead and I can solder all the other pins. Again, not very difficult, take your time, but as I said, firstly, apply the soldering iron to the pin. Apply the soldering iron to the pin and bring up the solder. Apply the soldering iron to the pin and bring the solder. Apply the soldering iron. This is getting boring, I know, but I'll just do a few of these and give you an idea. So it's really important that you heat up both the items you're going to solder before you introduce the soldering, the actual solder. You can see the fumes coming off those. That's the flux burning off. It's not very pleasant, and you want to try and avoid it. In fact, if I'm going to do a lot of soldering, I actually have a little extraction fan that sits on the bench behind and pulls the solder flux smoke away. So once more, heat up the pin and the pad, and then apply the solder. Heat up the pin and the pad, and then apply the solder. And you will find that the solder will flow onto the joint. You see those joints? You see how smooth those joints are. They're smooth and they're bright, and they're not dry. Dry joints don't look like that. And I could do more, but I probably won't. I'm hopefully going to show you some of the techniques and how to get to that point, bearing in mind I've been soldering for many, many years, and you may not be instantly be able to achieve that kind of result. But the most important thing, once again, and notice cleaning the device every time, is heat up both items with the soldering iron and then apply the solder. Heat up both items with the soldering iron and then apply the solder. You can see it bubbling as the flux comes out of the joint. Heat up both items and then apply the solder. Both items and then apply the solder. So you can see it's not difficult. You need a steady hand, yes, to a certain extent. And you need to make sure that if you do a proper joint, there's no problem with this sort of density. 0.1 of an inch is the standard matrix of electronics and PC boards, printed circuit boards. This is called a printed circuit board. And it's very easy to get perfectly clean. You can see perhaps there's a little bit of flux now on this surface here. And what I would normally do is just scrape that off when I've finished. And with a brush, just brush it out the way. A little paintbrush, you don't need anything very superb for that. But I hope that just gives you a bit of insight. And that's probably really all I want to do today, just to give you an introduction. But I'll do a number of these videos and show you how to solder different things. I'll show you how to prepare components. This is a bag of leaded resistors. And there are various ways to prepare these for soldering. These are all pretty inexpensive components. I think that this whole box of resistors of pretty much every single value, complete with color code and everything else, was probably less than £10. But there are very useful little devices that we can use. So as a typical leaded component, that's a resistor. And in order to get the spacing right on the board, this little bit of plastic, you just put the resistor between it, bend the legs over, and voila, you have it correctly spaced to plug in your board without having to go and hold pliers and twist and all the rest of it. So we'll do more of that as we go forward. So I hope you found that interesting, and I hope you find it useful. And if you have a look at my website, all of the stuff that I've talked about here is detailed there. So by all means, go and have a look. Amazon is your friend. I think it's Black Friday week. It seems to be Black Friday week every week at the moment, but nonetheless, go and have a look and see what you can find. Thank you very much indeed for watching. 73 is from me, and I hope you have a great day.
We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.